In this video lesson, we'll explore the impact of Manifest Destiny on the Mexican War. Polk and other disciples of Manifest Destiny had long coveted California's verdant valleys, and especially the spacious Bay of San Francisco, which was the future gateway to the Pacific. The population of California in 1845 was curiously mixed. It consisted of perhaps 13,000 Spanish Americans and as many as 75,000 dispirited Indians. There were fewer than 1,000 foreigners, mostly Americans. Polk was eager to buy California from Mexico, but relations with Mexico City were dangerously embittered. The United States had claims against the Mexicans for some $3 million in damages to American citizens and their property, and they had agreed to assume the debt. A more serious bone of contention was Texas. The Mexican government, after threatening war if the United States should acquire the Lone Star Republic, had recalled its minister from Washington following annexation, and diplomatic relations were completely severed. The deadlock with Mexico over Texas was further tightened by a question of boundaries. During the long era of the Spanish-Mexican occupation, the southwestern boundary of Texas had been the Nueces River, but expansive Texans were claiming the more southern Rio Grande. Instead, Polk felt an obligation to defend Texas and its claim. In Mexicans' eyes, all of Texas was still theirs, although temporarily in revolt, and a dispute over the two rivers seemed pointless. Yet Polk was careful to keep American troops out of the explosive no-man's land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. The Golden Prize of California continued to cause Polk much anxiety. Disquieting rumors were circulating that Britain was about to buy or seize California, a grab that Americans could not tolerate under the Monroe Doctrine. So Polk dispatched John Slidell to Mexico City as a minister late in 1845 and was instructed to offer a maximum of $25 million for California and territory to the east, but the proud Mexican people wouldn't even accept him. A frustrated Polk was now prepared to force a showdown. On January 13, 1846, he ordered 4,000 men and General Zachary Taylor to march from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande, provocatively near Mexican forces. Polk expected at any moment to hear of a clash, but when none occurred after an anxious wait, he informed his cabinet on May 9, 1846, that he proposed to ask Congress to declare war on the basis of unpaid claims and the rejection of Slidell. That very evening, news of bloodshed arrived. On April 25, 1846, Mexican troops had crossed the Rio Grande and attacked General Zachary Taylor's command, losing 16 men. Polk sent a vigorous war message to Congress, declaring that despite all our efforts to avoid a clash, hostilities had been forced upon the country by the shedding of American blood upon American soil. A patriotic Congress voted overwhelmingly for war, and anti-slavery Whig bastions melted and joined the rest of the nation. In his message to Congress, Polk was making history. A Whig congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, requested information as to the precise spot on American soil where American bloodshed had been shed, because it could have been considered Mexican soil. The more extreme anti-slavery agitators of the North, many of them Whigs, branded the president a liar. Polk the mendacious, but did Polk provoke the war? California was an imperative point in his program, and Mexico would not sell it at any price. The only way to get it was to use force or wait for an internal American revolt. Delay seemed dangerous, as the British might have seized California, and grievances against Mexico were annoying yet tolerable. But by 1846, patience had ceased to be a virtue, as far as Polk was concerned. But on grasping California by fair or foul means, he pushed the quarrel to a bloody showdown. Both sides were spoiling for a fight. Feisty Americans, especially Southwestern expansionists, were eager to teach the Mexicans a lesson, and the Mexicans, in turn, were burning to humiliate the bullies of the North, in other words, the United States. Possessing a considerable standing army, Heavily overstaffed with generals, they boasted of invading the U.S., freeing the black slaves, and lassoing whole regiments of Americans. They were hoping that the quarrel with Britain over Oregon would mean war. A conquest of Mexico's vast and arid expanses seemed fantastic, especially in view of the bungling American invasion of Canada in 1812. Both sides were fired by moral indignation. Mexican people and Americans thought that they could fight with righteousness. Polk wanted California, not war. But when war came, he hoped to fight it on a limited scale and then pull out when he had captured the prize, the dethroned Mexican dictator Santa Anna, who had then been exiled to Cuba. Let it be known that if the blockading squadron would permit him to slip into Mexico, he would sell out his country, and Polk agreed to this deal. Once Santa Anna returned to Mexico, he proceeded to rally his countrymen to a defense. American operations in the Southwest and California were completely successful. In 1846, General Stephen Kearny led a detachment of 1,700 troops over the Santa Fe Trail from Fort Leavenworth and captured Santa Fe. When war broke out, Captain John C. Fremont just so happened to be there with several dozen well-armed men, and helping to overthrow Mexican rule in 1846, he collaborated with American naval officers and with the local Americans. General Zachary Taylor had been spearheading the main thrust. He was known as Old Rough and Ready because of his iron constitution and incredibly unsoldier-like appearance. He fought his way across the Rio Grande into Mexico. After several gratifying victories, he reached Buena Vista, where on February 22nd to 23rd, 1847, his weakened force of 5,000 men were attacked by some 20,000 march-weary troops under Santa Anna. The Mexicans were finally repulsed, and overnight Zachary Taylor became the hero of Buena Vista. He will eventually become president. Sound American strategy now called for a crushing blow at the enemy's vitals in Mexico City. General Taylor could not win decisively in the semi-deserts of northern Mexico, and the command of the main expedition, which pushed inland from Veracruz early in 1847, was entrusted to General Winfield Scott, a hero from the War of 1812. General Winfield Scott was severely handicapped in the Mexican campaign by inadequate numbers of troops, by expiring enlistments and a more numerous enemy, mountainous terrain, and disease, and by political backbiting at home. Yet he succeeded in battling his way up to Mexico City by September of 1847 in one of the most brilliant campaigns in American military history. Polk was anxious to end shooting after securing his territorial goals. He sent along with Scott's invading army the chief clerk of the State Department, Nicholas P. Trist. Trist and Scott arranged for an armistice with Santa Anna at the cost of $10,000. The wily dictator pocketed the bribe and then used the time to bolster his defenses. Negotiating a treaty with a sword in one hand and a pen in the other was ticklish business. Polk, disgusted with his blundering envoy, abruptly recalled Trist, but the worldly diplomat dashed off a 65-page letter explaining why he was not coming back. Grasping a fleeting opportunity to negotiate, Trist signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848, and forwarded it to Washington. The terms of the treaty confirmed the American title to Texas and yielded an enormous area stretching westward to Oregon and the ocean and embracing California. This total expanse, including Texas, was about one-half of Mexico that now belonged to the United States. The United States agreed to pay $15 million for the land and assume the claims of its citizens against Mexico. Polk submitted the treaty to the Senate, and Trist had succeeded. Speed was imperative. The anti-slavery Whigs in Congress were denouncing this damnable war with increasing heat. Having secure control of the House in 1847, they were even threatening to vote down supplies for the armies in the field. If they had done so, Scott would have been forced to retreat. A swelling group of expansionists, intoxicated by manifest destiny, was clamoring for all of Mexico. If America had seized the nation, it would have been saddled with an expensive and very difficult policing problem. The South could not be too greedy. The treaty was finally approved by the Senate, 38-14, and it was condemned by those opponents who wanted all of Mexico and by opponents who wanted none. Victors rarely pay an indemnity, especially a costly conflict that had been forced. Yet Polk arranged to pay over $18 million, and cynics have charged that the Americans were pricked by guilty conscience. Apologists pointed to the spirit of fair play. A decisive factor was the need for haste. While there was still a responsible Mexican government to carry out the treaty and before political foes in the United States sabotaged Polk's expansionist program. The Mexican War was a small one that cost some 13,000 American lives, but most of them were taken by disease, but the fruits of the fighting were enormous. America's total expanse was increased by about one-third, an addition even greater to that of the Louisiana Purchase. The Mexican War was the blood-spattered schoolroom of the Civil War. The campaigns provided field experience for most of the officers that were destined to become leading generals in the upcoming Civil War conflict, including Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. The Military Academy at West Point, which had been founded in 1802, fully justified its existence through the well-trained officers. And the Navy was also very useful and did valuable work in throwing a crippling blockade around Mexican ports. The Army waged war without defeat and without a major blunder. Opposing armies emerged with increased respect for each other as the Mexicans, though poorly led, fought heroically. Mexicans have never forgotten that their northern enemy tore away about half their country, even though they had been paid something for the land. The war also marked an ugly turning point in relations between the United States and Latin America as a whole, as the United States was increasingly feared as the Colossus of the North. The war re-aroused slavery issues. Abolitionists assailed the Mexican conflict as one provoked by the Southern slaveocracy for evil purposes. The bulk of American volunteers were admittedly from the South and from the Southwest, but this was really based on proximity, not conspiracy. Quarreling over slavery's extension also erupted on the floor of the Congress. In 1846, Polk had requested an appropriation of $2 million with which he could buy peace. Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, fearful of the Southern slaveocracy, introduced an amendment called the Wilmot Proviso, which stipulated that slavery should never exist in any of the territories to be wrested from Mexico. The amendment passed twice in the House, but failed in the Senate. Southern members, unwilling to be robbed of prospective slave states, fought restriction, and anti-slavery men battled no less bitterly for the exclusion of slaves. The Wilmot Proviso, as it was called, eventually endorsed by the legislatures of all but one of the free states, soon came to symbolize the burning issue of slavery in the territories. The opening shots of the Mexican War were effectively the opening shot of the Civil War. President Polk left the nation the splendidly physical heritage of California and the Southwest, but also the ugly moral heritage of an embittered slavery dispute. Mexicans could later take some satisfaction in knowing that the territory had proved to be a venomous apple of discord that could well be called the Revenge of Santa Anna. And we'll discuss more about the impact of Mexico on the United States in our lesson in class.